I will begin discussing this last approach to the conduct of life that we consider here, and specifically with reference to the philosophy of Schopenhauer. And I proceed in the following steps. First, to place this approach and Schopenhauer's philosophy as an instance of it in the context of our broader inquiry and argument in the course. Second, to remind you of the incitements, of the prompts that inspire this approach to existence. Third, to discuss its metaphysical background, the view of the world that it presupposes. Fourth, to suggest the general orientation to living that results from it. Fifth, to outline the methods by which it proposes to implement this approach. What was that? The fifth is to describe the problems or the main objection to it from outside its own idea world. Sixth, to point to its most significant internal contradiction. And seventh, to discuss the sense in which or the extent to which it could be reshaped, as we have proposed to reshape the other two approaches described in the course. And in dealing with this orientation to existence, I am more struck than ever by the incongruity of attempting to sustain such a discussion in the context of an academic course at Harvard University. But so be it. There are no venues in the world suitable to what matters most, and we must settle for the venues that exist and play with the cards that we have rather than the ones that we would like to have. So first then, the place of this approach to existence in the context of the argument of the course. The other two approaches that we have considered here, the project of nonconformity and self-invention, and the project of responsibility and solidarity, as I have called them, have anchors in the functional requirements of the advanced societies. On the one hand, in the imperative of enhancing capable agency, the project of nonconformity of self-invention. On the other hand, in the imperative of developing the higher forms of cooperation. This orientation to existence is different from those two in this respect, that it seems not to be based on any such functional imperative. It is a disturbance. And so its persistence in the history of ideas is all the more remarkable, and suggests that it comes from something deep within ourselves. It's not just a philosophy expressed by certain thinkers in certain places and times. It is a recurrent attitude to existence Its essence has to do with the rejection of the world as it appears to us and of life, and the refusal to engage in what it would consider power worship. If the world as it is established and life as we experience it is a kind of power. But no one who never experienced this way of thinking and the attitudes that it recommends would be fully human. So this orientation to existence has some deep connection within us and tells us something precious about the enigmas of existence. To me, it has a very special meaning, as exemplified by the philosophy of Schopenhauer's, because in some respects, the philosophy of Schopenhauer, the most consequential statement of this view in the history of Western philosophy, is the inverse of my own ideas, and therefore has for me a special attraction and force. Now, second, the recurrent motivations, the prompts to the development of this view of the world, which denies the world, rejects the world, and rejects the will, are striving within the world. It seems to me that there are three main prompts. The first prompt is the spectacle of the transience and transformation of everything in the world. The pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander, speaking from the beginnings of a very different philosophical tradition, said, "Everything turns into everything else under the dominion of time. Everything is ephemeral. Everything is made out of everything else." So this spectacle of the ephemeral, of transience, is the first prompt to the development of this view of the world. The second prompt is the experience of consciousness. We all live in the present, in what you could call the augmented present. The past that is ceasing to be, the future that is beginning, the now that is moving from the past to the future. And this present moment, which is life in the present, which is all any of us ever has, is experienced by us as consciousness, not in some raw objective form. And consciousness seems to be only loosely connected to our individuality or selfhood. We're able to discern the consciousness of others or the signs of this consciousness. And this experience suggests to us that consciousness is not bounded to the transient selves and entities in which it is temporarily embodied. And that then is the second prompt to the formation of this view of the world. The entities, the selves, are ephemeral. But consciousness seems to be persistent and universal. And Schopenhauer was further encouraged in the development of this view by the influence of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And Kant's thesis that all of our experience is mediated by certain structures of consciousness. We have no unmediated access to things as they are in themselves. Now, the third prompt to this view of the world is the experience of life as an ordeal. Life is dreamlike, but also tormented, because we are chained to the treadmill of endless desire. Our desires are insatiable. All we have around us is the finite, and from the finite we demand the infinite. So our experience is an experience of perpetual desire. The desire is temporarily satisfied, and then we experience first boredom, unused capacity, unfilled experience, and then more desire. And we continue then chained to this treadmill of insatiability, which is a perpetual torment from which we desire to be released. And that then is the third incitement to the formation of this view, which we could call the overcoming of the world and of the will. Now I come to the third step in my remarks, which is the metaphysical background to this view and the placement of this metaphysical background in the world history of philosophy. So technically, in the history of philosophy, we could call this metaphysical background a speculative and atemporal monism. In its most radical form, its idea is that ultimate reality is unified. And not only unified, but timeless. So all the distinctions that pervade our experience are epiphenomenal and even illusory. And change itself is an illusion. The only thing that is really or ultimately real is unified and timeless being. Now, we have this view manifest in important strands of the philosophy of ancient India and in the Vedanta and the Upanishads, and then in Buddhism. But we have also manifestations of it in the history of Western philosophy, in the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, and to some extent in Spinoza, but in the most comprehensive and intransigent form in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. This is the radical version of the speculative and atemporal monism. Now, there is also a qualified version of this speculative and atemporal monism, and the qualified version, instead of denying any reality to the distinctions and to the transformations that mark our experience, confers on them a lower degree of reality. So it imagines, this qualified version, that there is a hierarchy of levels of being, and that at the highest levels of the hierarchy, we transcend the superficial distinctions and find the roots or the types of things and approach a reality that is eternal and unified by steps. Thus, the chain of being or the hierarchy of being. And one famous version of this qualified speculative monism is the middle and later philosophy of Plato and his so-called theory of ideas or of forms. but also Neoplatonism, and especially the philosophy of Plotinus. Now, if we take this view of speculative and atemporal monism, especially in its radical and intransigent form, there appear to be two main metaphysical problems with it, problems with its coherence or clarity. The first problem is its failure to address the riddle of why it is that this unified and atemporal reality presents itself in the world under a form that is the opposite of its truth. So it is unified and atemporal, but its presentation in experience is a presentation that is characterized by distinctions and by transformations, that is, by time. Why does this unified and atemporal reality disguise itself? None of the philosophers of speculative monism seem to have even attempted to give an answer to that question, but it would seem to be central to the development of this view. The second subsidiary metaphysical problem is the difficulty of accounting for, if not the reality, at least the experience of transformation. So even on the radical view of the speculative monism, there is transformation in the world. And transformation requires causation. And causation is in turn connected to time. How can we make sense of the experience of transformation unless there is causal connection and temporal sequence? So this second metaphysical problem is, in a sense, an extension of the first metaphysical problem. Now I want to go back to an idea that was raised earlier in the course. So this tradition of speculative and atemporal monism, in both its radical and its qualified forms, is one of the two main traditions in the world history of philosophy. It is the tradition that was hegemonic in ancient India, but was the dissident tradition in the history of Western philosophy. And conversely, in ancient India, there was a dissident form of what was hegemonic in the philosophy of the West. So there isn't a simple one-to-one relation between the major traditions in the world history of philosophy and these and particular parts of the world, because the two major traditions were present even when they were not hegemonic. The other major tradition is the tradition that has been predominant in the history of Western philosophy, and is the tradition that you could call the Greek philosophy of being, or the project of classical ontology. So the central idea in this second tradition is that there is a basic structure of the world, the elementary constituents of the world and of nature. And this basic structure of the world is governed by certain regularities that in the vocabulary of modern science we describe as the laws, symmetries, and constants of nature. So this view of the Greek philosophy of being, which we have most influentially in the philosophy of Aristotle, and of everything that followed from it, in a sense continues in the major tradition of fundamental modern physics, from Galileo and Newton to quantum mechanics and relativity. So in this view, time is real, but not too real or not completely real. Because there is an exemption from time accorded to the basic structure of nature and to the laws, symmetries, and constants in the vocabulary of modern science. Now, of course, there's a complication in the history of modern science. Because after the two major paradigms of 20th century physics were developed, quantum mechanics and special relativity, followed by general relativity, after they first emerged, the historical character of the universe was discovered in the 1920s. And if the universe as a whole is historical, every part of it must be historical. And we now have reason to think that all of those aspects of nature that we regard as permanent, not just the periodic table, but the standard model of particle physics and the laws of nature as we now know them, once did not exist in early moments of the history of the universe. So there's some contradiction already between what we know about the world and this Greek philosophy of being as extended in the basic paradigm of modern science. Now, notice that these two major philosophical traditions, the speculative monism and the Greek philosophy of being, have something very important in common. What they have in common is the association of reality with eternity, or timelessness. They both say that what is most real is what is least time-bound. The unitary atemporal reality, or these basic structures and laws of nature. They're somehow exempt from time. And they're most real because they are exempt from time, or their exemption from time is a manifestation of their higher degree of reality. That's what these two opposing traditions have in common. Now, it seems that there must be a third position. And the third position would be the position that says everything that exists or has ever existed or will ever exist in the world is ephemeral, is transient, but no less real on that account. So in other words, this third position would dissociate temporality from the lack of reality. It would say there is no atemporal permanent structure of the world, and there are no atemporal regularities, laws, symmetries, and constants. Everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. The ways in which things change. And this is not as mysterious as it may sound, because in natural history, in the life sciences, we have a way of thinking in this form, although it is a local rather than a universalized way. We think first that all the causal sequences are context-bound and loosely connected. Second, we think that there are no immutable types of things or natural kinds. All types are mutable. And the way in which one kind of thing differs from another itself changes. So, for example, in geology, the different kinds of rocks are not different from one another in the same way. An igneous rock has an identity that has a different character from a sedimentary or metamorphic rock, and so forth. And so this view would just be the generalization of that conception of reality. Now here's what's really strange. What's really strange is that this third position, which on its face would seem to be the most plausible and the one empirically best founded, speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. There is no comprehensive and explicit development of this view of the world in general philosophy to this day. And this is connected with the problems of the history of social thought and our understanding of ourselves. We don't have a general view that makes sense of our experience. And therefore, in dealing with our experience, we have to treat our experience as somehow an exception, even a miraculous exception to the way in which the world generally works. And that helps account for another striking feature of the history of Western philosophy, which is the dominion of a series of successive dualisms between nature and grace, between material things and mental things, as in Descartes, between the thing in itself and consciousness in Kant, between the world of history and society and the world of nature in modern historicism, and so forth. So it's as if the compensation for the absence of this third position were the appeal to the dualisms. So nature works in a certain way. In that way, as we understand, there's no space for us. So we make an exception for us. And that's the dualisms. Now, this is connected to the themes of our course in the following way. That the deepened and reconstructed version of the two main projects that we have discussed here, which seem to require, as their philosophical setting, the development of this third position. And we don't have it. So this is the open philosophical horizon, a subject of immense history, and to my mind, the great frontier in general philosophical thinking now. So now I come to the third step in these remarks. And the third step, actually it's the fourth step, right? Because the first step was the placement in our argument. The second step was the prompts, the motivations to this view. The third step was the metaphysical background. And now the fourth step is the general orientation to existence, to the conduct of life that results from this view of the world. And in the most general terms, the aim is to achieve a combination of serenity and benevolence, given this terrifying, enigmatic, and tormented character of existence. So this project, then, is a characteristic example of what at the very beginning of our course I described as the characteristic attitude of classical philosophy, which is to be a super science in the service of self-help. So the super science is the claim to understand the fundamentals, the framework of existence. And the self-help is self-help with which to face the incurable flaws in the human condition, and especially our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. Now, it seems that we can't really do anything about our mortality and our groundlessness, except to claim that they don't exist. And that's what a great deal of classical philosophy does. It explains them away. And explaining them away is the only way of dealing with them. Because we can't change the apparent reality of our march to death and of our inability uncontroversially to establish the framework of existence. We can just argue that it's not so and tell some other story that somehow makes them go away. And that would then be the form of self-help. But with insatiability, it's different. And in a sense, the reverse. We can at least try to make insatiability go away. But we can't tell about ourselves a persuasive story that makes it seem that we don't experience it. So in a sense, it's the inverse. And that's part of this project, of this basic orientation. We'll get off the treadmill, the ordeal of insatiable desire. Now, there are two different registers in which we can implement this project. The minimalist register and the maximalist register, depending on the level of ambition in the project of self-help. You could call the minimalist register disentanglement, withdraw. Withdraw into a fortress. Steel yourself against these coils of illusion and suffering and insatiability. This withdrawal is still compatible with compassionate and sacrificial action in the world. But there is a limited level of hope. The maximalist register is more ambitious and more hopeful. Establish contact, communion with the ultimate unified and atemporal reality. And then you will experience a joyous serenity, because you will immerse yourself, submerge yourself into the real thing. That's the maximalist register. And it's as if they were different colors, attitudinal colors, associated with these degrees of hope in this project. So the emotional and cognitive character of the serenity and of the benevolence that accompanies it, benevolence because you recognize that you're all part of the same thing, with other people, with other parts of the world. It's this one reality. The character of the serenity and of the benevolence will change, depending on where you're placed in this spectrum from the minimalist to the maximalist register. Now then, fifth, the methods by which this project is to be implemented. Very clearly set out in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. And there appear to be 4 methods, connected with each other and loosely on some spectrum. And there is a loose relation between this spectrum and that movement from the minimalist to the maximalist. So the first and most limited method is concentration. Self-absorption in the experience of consciousness in the present moment filtering out the extraneous and the peripheral so that you can profit from the internal connection of consciousness in the augmented present to the unified and atemporal reality. And to this end, you must cast a spell on yourself and prepare certain disciplines of the mind that allow you to have this experience of deepening. Deepening into yourself, and the self is like the tunnel or the channel that will take you to the unified or atemporal being. The second method is the method of asceticism. To overcome the will, the striving of the will in this world of illusory distinctions and time, you must impose restraint and even suffering on yourself. Now here's something psychologically paradoxical. How can the way to escape suffering be to make yourself suffer? But the idea seems to be that by the application of the discipline of asceticism, you break the will and you liberate yourself from this insatiable striving that entangles you in the coils of illusion, in the treadmill of insatiable desire. The third method is the method of the disinterested contemplation of the world, the will-less contemplation of the world, as we have it in art or in philosophy, in which you are able to establish a relation to the world and to your experience that is not tainted, that is not poisoned by this constant striving of insatiable desire. You look at it from a disinterested perspective. And this also liberates you, this project of self-help. The fourth method, and the highest and most complete method, is compassionate and sacrificial action, which enacts in the world your awareness of your communion with all the others and with everything. And so it is the acting out, the practical manifestation of this view of the world. And it is a kind of redemption, a salvation from this ordeal into which you're otherwise engaged. So, just to remind you of what the steps have been so far. The placement in our inquiry of this view, the motivations to it, the metaphysical background, the general project or orientation, and the methods by which it is implemented. Now comes I guess, what is the sixth step? The criticism of it from the outside, from the standpoint of the other traditions, and especially from the standpoint of the first. What is the objection, the first objection that would be made from the standpoint of someone who doesn't, from the outset, subscribe to the assumptions or of this view, or who resists the motivations that prompt it? The first objection, the fundamental objection, is that it denies what is central to our experience, which is the attachment to life. The fascination of life, the radiance of the world, the experience that by living we we have a gift incomparable to any other. And this desire to live and to continue living at any cost is a central part of our natural constitution. And we don't have to idealize it. Schopenhauer derided it. In the first few pages of The World as Will and Representation, he says, at any given time in the world, countless numbers of animals are tearing one another apart, alive, in order just to live a little more. And this is our natural constitution. And so it seems that this view is denying that central fact about us. And everything that we associate with life, its supreme qualities of surfeit over context, or of spontaneity and of surprise. Everything that we have in real life and could not have in an eternal paradise, and that makes life worth living. But this attraction of life is enhanced by another factor, which is the political experience, the historical experience of our own time, of our own moment in history. So now this most powerful project in the world, this revolutionary project that has set the world on fire, that commands the agenda of humanity, that is resisted by the other projects, is a project of empowerment for the ordinary man and woman, with its political side of liberalism, socialism, democracy, and its personalist side of the worldwide romanticism. And it says we can ascend and increase our share in the divine attribute of humanity, of transcendence, and make ourselves more human by making ourselves more godlike. So this endeavor has enormous power in the world, and this project sets its face against it. But the defender of the project would say, so what? Its assumptions are illusory and self-destructive. But that's the criticism, as it were, from the outside of the idea world. Now, then come to the second step, the seventh step. The criticism of this view from the inside of its own idea world, taking its own assumptions as given. And I want to formulate this criticism in two equivalent ways. So one way of formulating the criticism is that there appears to be a contradiction in this view, or what it demands or from us or proposes to us, between the theoretical and the practical antidotes to nihilism. So what I mean by nihilism is the view that the world and our lives within it are meaningless. And therefore all this suffering is for nothing. Now, the theoretical antidote that this view seems to propose to that experience of nihilism is the hope of connection to the real, unified, and atemporal reality in the minimalist form of disentanglement or in the maximalist form of communion. But there's a price. And the price is to undermine or discredit, in some sense, the particular engagements and connections that we have, and which are the objects of the will, of our striving, and to undermine our striving itself, that is, to attack these connections and engagements from both sides, from the side of their objects and from the side of their source. That's the implication of the theoretical antidote to nihilism. But what's the practical antidote to nihilism? The practical antidote to nihilism is connection and engagement in all of our experience. What does it mean to overcome nihilism and its psychological manifestation, depression generally? It's to be connected, it's to be engaged. That's what brings us back to ourselves and to life. Now, I'm going to read you a famous paragraph from David Hume's treatise on human nature. Well, Hume, of course, was not a representative of the speculative monism, but there's a connection in the following way, that his philosophy was a skeptical philosophy, which in its speculative inquiries discredited our conventional view of how the world works and how it's connected. For example, causation, which he held to be a matter of convention or of custom and not the way things really are. So the world is not like what it seems to be, and it makes no sense. So this is the theoretical problem of nihilism. Now, what does he say then is the practical antidote to this theoretical problem of nihilism? I'm going to read you the paragraph. Most fortunately, it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine. I play a game of backgammon. I converse and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. That's the practical antidote to nihilism, which seems to be in complete contradiction to the theoretical antidote that is proposed. The theoretical antidote in the speculative monism seems to aggravate the psychological experience of nihilism and to discredit, undermine, subvert the practical antidote. That's the contradiction. And it's manifest in many ways. So even if you go back in that scale of the methods by which this project of serenity and benevolence is to be implemented, the question is, will they work? So you can cast a spell on yourself, concentration, obsession, deepening in yourself. Will you reach the unified atemporal being, or will you become a crank? And given who we really are, what will it really be like? Will this promise of happiness be kept? We're more complicated than this view seems to countenance. So there's another vocabulary, an equivalent vocabulary in which to describe this problem of the internal criticism. Equivalent vocabulary is this, and I mentioned it at the end of class last week. So we have this ordeal of insatiability under the shadow of death. What's the solution? The solution is to die beforehand. So physical suicide, according to Schopenhauer, is bad, not because it's evil, but because it's futile. Since we can't escape this ordeal of existence, but we can, by this decathexis, as the Freudians would call it, by this disentanglement, by this giving up, by this renunciation. We can escape the illusions of life and its false promises, its radiant spectacle of surfeit, spontaneity, and surprise. But what will that be? It seems that will be a foretaste of death. And this is another way of stating what seems to be the internal contradiction in this view. Now, I come now to the eighth step. And let me say, remind you of the spirit of my inquiry. So I think there's something deep in this view. And as I said at the outset, its depth is reinforced by this fact that it arises perpetually in our experience and in the history of thought, although it has no anchor in the practical and functional requirements of social life. It's only an interruption or a threat, and it comes anyway. So it must be saying something deep. But the question is, in the light of these criticisms, the external criticism, the internal criticism, can we reshape this view in the way in which we both propose to reshape the other two main projects, which have been the central subject of our discussion in the course? Reshape those views so that it's not that there would be a synthesis between them, but that they would both be taken to a higher level and made stronger, and that the contest between them would persist, but it would persist in a higher and more fertile form. Can we do something equivalent for this third view? Can we take it to a higher level? I don't see how. It has an internal integrity, a crystalline logic. It is relentless in its demands and its assumptions. It is what it is. And it raises for each of us, and perpetually for humanity, the question of the relation between hope and insight. Well, that's what I wanted to say by way of presenting this view and its relation to our argument.
Great.
Please comment.
Should I
Please,
respond? Oh, okay.
Respond, comment.
Absolutely. So I will voice a bit of disagreement. You won't be surprised to hear. First, in terms of some of the empirical views about this position, and then much more importantly, the larger philosophical implications, which, to underline again, I would say one of the goals here is to allow ourselves to be challenged by these ideas and find out what we can learn from them. And the goal, therefore, hopefully in these remarks will be to say, how can we present them in a way that will allow that challenge to occur? So very quickly, to begin with the comparative points you were mentioning in terms of the metaphysical issues, full agreement that these are key themes in the development of Western philosophy. As you very correctly noted, and very famously, Plato will argue that the world that we live in is one of endless flux, and beyond us are the realm of perfectly stable ideas that are permanent. Our goal is a philosophical contemplation to reach those. The degree to which we can is the degree to which we are achieving our highest philosophical goal, a position that, needless to say, plays a key role in later Western metaphysics, certainly very significant branches of Christianity. And you are absolutely right as well. Also within Western philosophy, there is, coming out of this tradition, a strong move to say, given this distinction between the world of flux here versus this metaphysical permanence beyond us, the world here of endless flux is a world in which we will be trapped by the vicissitudes of life, and therefore a contemplation and even a withdrawal to some higher plane would be the stage of redemption. I would, however, disagree a bit when we move to the comparative side of this. And let me begin with your point, again, with a quick agreement before I get to the larger disagreement. When you said that the historicity of everything speaks with the weakest voice in world philosophy, I would amend that to say, certainly in Western philosophy. But let me quickly mention, and I'll be quick since we've already discussed it, but in the Chinese tradition, and in Confucianism in particular that we looked at, this is the position. I mean, the position is think of the world as an endless interplay of these different energies. They can fall into patterns of interaction dangerously. This is equally true of we humans. Our danger is we ascribe that to be the way things naturally are. So when we look at the world beyond us, that is nature. We perceive it to be based upon permanent things governed by natural laws. In fact, it's changeable patterns of interaction, and we are largely responsible for the domestication of the world that created that false sense of a perfectly harmonious world. And of course, as we discussed, then the implications for us is even more dire. We have created a constructed world that we come to think of as natural. In fact, these are just patterns of interaction, and usually very dangerous ones, and the goal is to alter all of these. Then, moving to the central focus of the discussion here, the entire development of Buddhism, note here that a move of Buddhism that's very crucial is, in a sense, the opposite of Plato, right? I mean, the move of Buddhism is to say, kind of like the Chinese tradition, but much more extreme and with dramatically different implications ultimately, that the world that we perceive to be stable and permanent is, in fact, a world of flux. And the goal of the exercise is to break us from the danger of seeing permanency and stability. And the claims of what would ultimately be experienced and would, in fact, even ultimately exist were we to do this is explicitly described in terms of this negation. It's nirvana. It is an extinguishing of the will and the desires that we are creating a world through the will. In other words, because it's a negative distinction, you're not making a positive claim. You're not claiming we're going to achieve a permanent reality by getting rid of the vicissitudes of life. You're claiming we are going to break the world constructed by the will. Now, the reason I mention this is this, I think, is key for the entire vision of practice and ethics and the conduct of life that becomes so crucial in the tradition. Because note, the story of the Buddha is not one, and I suspect if you actually see variations of what I'm about to say in Schopenhauer's telling, but you don't see this in the Buddhist tradition itself. That version would go something along the following lines. The Buddha grows up. He strives to create a better world. He fails to create a better world. He is endlessly struck by the suffering and failures of everything he is doing. And finally, because of his own suffering and despair, he gives up and he withdraws and tries to find himself in a deeper, more permanent reality, serene from the vicissitudes of life. Note, that never appears in the Buddhist tradition. The story actually is the Buddha is not suffering at all. He's wonderfully happy, incredibly fulfilled. It's then when he is taken out of the palace that he realizes his entire life is, in fact, one that inherently creates suffering around him. He literally sees this in the story when he sees the horrible poverty that exists in order to allow his luxurious life in the palace to occur. But again, as we noted a week ago, the point of this is to say analogically, most of us are not going to be born in a palace and be a future ruler, but analogically, we are doing the same, right? We are, in the very way we are living, creating a world of endless suffering for those around us that we don't see. In this literal sense, going back to the story, in the sense that our lifestyle requires the exploitation of a huge number of people, condemning them to poverty, but then, of course, they also mean this in just an everyday sense. Our everyday way of interacting in the world is creating suffering that we're not seeing, And why? And this gets back, of course, to the key point. It's because we have constructed a world that we, again, come to see as natural, but we have constructed it through our will, our attempts in our will, through our striving to create a world in which our desires will be satisfied, not realizing that, number one, therefore, our will is really just an attempt to satisfy our own base desires, and then number two, not recognizing that the world we have so constructed is therefore by definition a world in which we are causing endless suffering. So it's not a private concern with suffering. No, the claim is that web of suffering will make suffering for everyone, including ultimately me, but it's not I'm suffering and therefore I should do sets of practices so I can become serene. It's I am creating a world of suffering and I want to break that. Then in terms of these key practices you're doing, from this point of view, the reason you're doing the practices is you are trying to break your own attachment to this world of suffering that we're creating such that you can act in it to save everyone else too. I mean, that's the goal. So when the Buddha, again, when he withdraws from this, he doesn't achieve personal serenity. In fact, he first attempts that and that fails. Then he realized, no, the key move is to then act in the world compassionately to save everyone else from the world of suffering that they are creating. And again, the key point is.
But that's a disagreement with my account.
Oh, no.
Because that was the fourth. That's the fourth method,
Indeed.
which is the highest.
Indeed.
Sacrificial action.
Although, but this is where we're going to slightly disagree. Then the move is to say those actions entail doing things to wake people up, the same way he had been woken up when he was taken out to see people, unintentionally by the guards, to see people starving because of his way of life. He is trying to wake people up to the suffering they are creating. So just to give a couple of more recent examples, Gandhi is coming directly out of this tradition when his move is to say, not how can I create a mass movement to overthrow British imperialism. The move is rather to say, actually, in the long run, that won't change ourselves any more than changing the world, even if we're successful. The goal is to do this other point, which is to wake the British up to the degree to which their proclaimed attempt to liberate the world is in fact based upon exploitation, and our own acceptance and involvement in that is part and parcel of this horrible form of suffering, and the actions are geared toward forcing people to realize this. So the famous moves, for example, he will march unarmed in front of a group of British soldiers who would literally take sticks and fracture the skulls of hundreds of people. And then the goal of this was to say, wake up. This is what you are doing in British imperialism. This is the world you are creating. Do not claim you're liberating us. You are literally destroying us. Or Gandhi's very famous statement in the law court when he's being held for sedition, and he looks at the judge, and instead of giving, he's a brilliant lawyer, he could have easily, I'm sure, given a brilliant rereading of some common practice from the 14th century that could have gotten him out of jail. Instead, he looks at the judge and says, no, if you actually think your laws are just, like if you think you are governing a just system of laws in which whoever between us, myself or the prosecution, can make the more convincing argument, and therefore I will be guilty or innocent based upon that, assuming in other words that it is a just system of laws and a just system for adjudicating disputes, if you really believe that, instead of playing the game, actually I'll just call you at your word. If you really believe that, I obviously am guilty of sedition, and you must throw me into hard labor. So do you believe your laws or not? So, of course, he's thrown into hard labor, and again, the move there is he is trying to wake the British up to the fact that they do not have a just system of laws. And all of this is, yes, is it sacrificial action, right? Definitely, it is extremely sacrificial action. But this is not a withdrawal to attain his own serenity. Sure. It's an attempt to wake people up to the suffering they are creating. A more recent example, when Buddhist monks will set themselves on fire, again, it's not, they're not withdrawing. I mean, they are setting themselves on fire to say, look at what you are doing. This is the result of the world that you have created. And if it's successful, and in each of these cases it clearly was, it breaks people from the world of suffering they are creating. And that's the key.
But
Yes.
just
Yes,
to
please.
press on this point,
Yeah,
so,
please.
and it relates to our earlier discussion about love in the first tradition in Christianity. So serenity and benevolence are a duo. So it's
Definitely.
not some kind of selfish serenity because it goes in the direction of a radical altruism. But it is different
Yes,
in its
definitely.
idea world and in its attitude from a form of moral experience organized around love. So let's remember the fundamental differences that we discussed before between altruism and love. So in the idea world that sees moral experience as organized around altruism, the problem is self-centeredness and selfishness. Self-centeredness is more general than selfishness. It's the same problem, that the individual places himself at the center. He has to renounce that or transcend that. In the love view, the organizing problem is this contradiction in our relation to the others. We need them. We develop through connection, but the connection is at jeopardy. And how are we to connect without losing ourselves? It's a different problem. It's not the problem of selfishness. The second distinction is that the altruism view requires sacrifice, but there's no epistemological threshold. In other words, there's no intractable problem of the obscurity of the other. And in this other view of love, the threshold problem is the imagination of the otherness of the other. That comes before everything else. And that's the essential problem. For this view, the distinction among selves is itself questionable. So the issue of obscurity of the other can't be central. Then the third difference is that in the altruism view, although sacrifice may be required, and even the sacrifice of life, it's a gift given from a distance and from on high. So it doesn't require equivalence of any kind. And in fact, if it's rebuffed, the gift becomes even greater. But that's not what love is like. And it does matter whether it's rebuffed or not. And then the fourth difference is implicit already in the third, is that in the altruism view, there's no pretense to equality. There can be this compassionate action, but it's not as if the two selves have to be situated on the same plane of experience. So this is a different, to my mind, this is a different view. Putting aside the question of the comparative merits of the view, the phenomenology of human connection, the view of connection, is a different view. And I don't think it serves us well speaking from within our tradition, influenced as it is by Romanticism and by Christianity and the Semitic monotheisms, to make these other views look more like them, because then somehow it will be more appealing to us, or it'll seem stronger to us. It's not clear that it's stronger because it's more like us. You know, that's so. It's a different view, and our interest is not to relativize the contrast, but to make the contrast sharp, so that we have the options clearly presented to us.
And here, let me say, I fully agree. The difference, though, is in terms of, I think, the goals of this, we absolutely do not want to bring these together, because that would mean we're not being challenged. I would also say, for the exact same reason, we don't want to present in this case, the two other positions that we're discussing in this course in ways that would not be challenging to our assumptions. And to go back to your example, the key, or at least one of the key ones that we would learn from the tradition in question here is, we certainly live in a world that absolutely is focused on the great heroic individual, and that great heroic individual striving through his or her will to achieve fulfillment in various ways, and we've discussed all the dangers of that position and possible ways of reconstructing it. But one of the key challenges that the current position would bring to the table is to say, at least look at the real possibility. Of course, they would say more than real possibility, the fact that that very attempt to construct the grand heroic individual with the grand will, striving to create a world of his own, except the fact that that vision of the will is itself based in our most grotesque desires, that the world that we have constructed, that we take for granted, is equally based upon that. And to get to your example, even when we talk about two people in a love relationship, what we're not focusing on is the entire conditions that are creating those two individuals defined that way. And the implication would be, and as soon as we're defining them that way, you're not really going to be forging that connection.
Of course. So this is what we
challenge.
discussed in the Nietzschean and Emersonian version of that first project. The individualist orientation, the idea of the strong individual above the weak herd, the absence of a political horizon, these are all perversions or failures. And that's what then led to the idea that that project to have a life in the future, to be appealing, has to be reshaped.
I agree.
I don't going back to the very end of my remarks, I don't really see how this project can be reshaped. And I think that it's not being reshapeable is related to this striking feature of it, that unlike the two projects that we've discussed, it doesn't seem to connect with any functional requirement of social life. That only, to my mind, emphasizes its remarkable strength, because how can it speak to us with such force from within ourselves without corresponding to this functional requirement? What is its practical contribution to social life? We can say it presents a gospel of compassion and so forth, but the view of the world and of humanity and of reality doesn't seem to connect with the requirements of the reorganization of the advanced societies in the way in which the other two projects connect. That's why suggestions like the knock on the door and the cry coming from within, rather than some imperative of the practical reformation of society.
Unless, of course, they're onto something that, in fact, our way of living in the world really is causing intense suffering around us without our recognizing it. And the practices they're advocating are the goal of them is to help us to see that horrible suffering that we're unintentionally creating. And the power of the tradition, therefore, and why it's as you said, has played such an intense role is because that fact is onto something. It is sadly onto something key to the way humans build social worlds. And speaking in that sense more dramatically than either of the two other positions of the degree to which our social world is inherently creating suffering around us that we are failing to notice.
Shall we open it up?
Open this up, absolutely.
So in the last class next week, the idea is we're going to focus on the general themes of the course. We'd like you to come prepared with comments and not just questions, and particularly on the question of argument and justification. So we're going to come back to the great theme of what in the first class I call the cognitive gap. So I remind you of the thesis that this question of the conduct of life, of what we are to do with our lives, of how we are to live, is the only question that no one can escape. It's the only question that has that character. Every other question we can escape. This question we can't, because the way in which we live will give an answer to it, whether or not we have explicit ideas about it. And then, so this is the weightiest question, but the arguments that we can give for taking one or another side in this debate, although they are not inconsequential, seem to be hopelessly disproportionate to the weight of the commitment. That's the cognitive gap. Now, that's not a feature of these arguments, according to this view. That's what things are like. We don't have a choice. And how are we going to position ourselves in relation to this problem? So what's remarkable, and I hope that the arguments throughout the semester have illustrated this, is that we can argue and present arguments in favor or against, and the most significant ones are not the ones that have the character of being a kind of report card. This is good, this is bad, this is the strong point, the weak point. It's the transformative issue. We receive the project from the history of thought in a particular form. And the question is, with respect to each of these projects, what can we turn it into? So the reason to engage in this criticism is to try and turn it into a stronger form. That's why we have to criticize it. And so we can make these criticisms and proposals and argue, but it seems that at the end of the day, the disproportion remains. So there's an argument, but the argument is inconclusive. That's very different from the position of relativism or skepticism. Because then there's the notion that comes from this that we can progress. How far we can progress, how far insight can reach, the mind can penetrate this stuff, we don't know. We don't know beforehand. We'll go as far as we can, and then we'll stop. And we'll stop not because there's some a priori stopping, but because we ran out of time and we'll die. And so that's the situation. And it's that question that I hope will be at the center of our discussion next week, and that I hope you'll think about in the intervening week. But let's go back to our discussion of today.
Yes, please.
Schopenhauer sort of spoke a lot about like the denial of the will.
Yes.
In order to escape suffering. And then it wasn't super clear to me why like the denial of the will to live doesn't manifest itself in suicide. Like what? I mean, I read like those couple of pages later.
Of the futility of suicide.
Yeah, what exactly? Suicide fails to be like the perfect manifestation of this denial of the will to live.
Well, because right in the radical version of this, we're all the same thing. So we continue to live. We can destroy the ephemeral and mortal self, but we return to the unified being. And of course, in the ancient Indian versions, there's the whole doctrine of reincarnation. We can't escape existence just by choosing to escape it. So, but this is a heroic view. You really have to give some literal meaning to these metaphysical claims of the unqualified form of the speculative monism. To most of us, it would seem that suicide literally can be successful. That is, we can destroy ourselves, even though Schopenhauer casts doubt on our ability to do so from this metaphysical standpoint.
Although let me also use the occasion to draw a contrast between Schopenhauer here, who is in this sense, I think, very characteristically in the Western tradition that we've been discussing, versus classical Buddhism.
Of course.
Absolutely.
And versus ancient Indian philosophy. Because this is an aspect of Buddhism that came from before.
Indeed, indeed.
And from this doctrine of the unified reality and of the cycle of reincarnation.
Well, and even outside of that, since we have a bit of a disagreement on the metaphysical side of this, but even in classical Buddhism, a part of the key too is suicide would be selfish, right? I mean, the goal of, say, a monk putting himself on fire, you're not doing that to escape the world, you're doing that to wake people up to the horrible suffering they are creating. And so if you do a huge sacrificial act, you would only do it ethically to wake people up. So when Gandhi marches people in front of the British batons, it's not a sacrifice. I mean, it's a sacrificial act, but it's not a withdrawal act. It's to wake people up. Like, look, this is what your empire is really about. It's literally cracking people's skulls open. So from this perspective of classical Buddhism, suicide is selfish. I mean, your goal is to help people. Now, I think you're right. That's arguably something Schopenhauer might try to claim. I agree with you. I don't think he's, well, I'll go back to what I said before. I think there's a real difference between Schopenhauer and classical Buddhism on this point of view. What Schopenhauer really
Of course,
does
by
represent-
Buddhism, you're speaking about Buddhism, but consistently, Michael, in your presentation, you're emphasizing Mahayana Buddhism and this. So you're associating Mahayana Buddhism with the original teachings of the Buddha. And there's all the other stuff in the history of Buddhism
there is, yeah.
that would go in another direction.
Indeed. I mean, we've had one session on Buddhism and one on Confucianism.
And of course,
But-
the advantage of the prophet is we know very little about what he really said. So we can say he's the good part and associate him with the later evolution of Mahayana Buddhism. But that's not very different from the history of these other religions like Christianity.
Oh, all of which
Yeah,
go, and
yeah.
yes, and if we had more time, we trace all of the differences. But nonetheless, to go back to Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer really does represent, as Roberto was saying before, a vision of radical despair. Just a humorous note, when I took a course once on Schopenhauer, the professor who was a Schopenhauerian picked up, and you can check on the internet, just pictures of Schopenhauer. He's this very dour man. And the professor opens the class by holding up this picture of Schopenhauer, and he says, "This is not a happy man."
This is Schopenhauer at the end of his life. There's another famous
indeed.
picture of him as a sensual adolescent.
Indeed.
So then you wonder what happened in the meantime.
Exactly. Well, and I think when I gave that kind of the not correct story of the Buddha, and I said Schopenhauer actually might be the only one who would accept this view, I think that's kind of a story of Schopenhauer. I mean, you really get the impression that Schopenhauer was someone who tried early on to strive for his own happiness and fulfillment in all sorts of salacious ways, became miserable, and it's really about his suffering, right? He's miserable, he is in despair, he is suffering, that he turns to his claim of Buddhism. But I think it's quite different from Buddhism to say, I will withdraw. So that position of withdrawal is certainly one he holds. It's really not one that you find strong in the Buddhist tradition, which is all about acting in the world to wake people up from the suffering they're creating.
Yes.
Which means in the Buddhist tradition, you would not commit suicide. I agree with Schopenhauer, it's more of a philosophical problem because since it's all about his own suffering, not the suffering that we are creating with others, there's less of an argument from Schopenhauer's perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the question for us, and this is the question for the last class, is this just one opinion against another opinion? Or is this about the truth of the world? And I reminded you in the first class of these two contradictory statements of Schopenhauer about his own philosophy. So in the second preface to The World as Will and Representation, he says, my philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence. So philosophy is the super science in the service of self-help. Then in the book itself, he says, a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. So how can these two statements be true? Unless you assume that there is one category of temperament that somehow has an inner affinity with the truth. And that would require another set of metaphysical presuppositions.
Indeed.
Yes?
Following up on the notion of temperament, you recall William James's reading of philosophy, where he says that true philosophy should be read.
Can you speak louder, please?
Where William James, in the beginning of the Pragmatism, says that the history of philosophy could be read as the history of temperament, right? And when one asks the question of how should I live my life, I think that is a different question from the question of how should we live our life. It seems that the I of the first question grounds the question in a temperament.
Yeah. But this was the skeptical element in William James. So understand, I mentioned this also, that a lady in Boston society consulted William James, asked him, Should I take up religion? He gave the characteristic American answer. Try it out and see if you like it. So this is a deflationary answer. That was William James. But what we're trying to establish in this argument is if there's some truth of the matter in some sense, which is not just adequacy to temperament.
And just to underline that, I do think there is a danger in Schopenhauer. We're reading someone whose philosophy is based on temperament. He's unhappy, and it's a figure of a man at the end of his life whose attempts at leading a successful, fulfilled life have failed. He is personally in despair. Again, I would draw a strong contrast with that to the Buddhist claim that we are trying to wake ourselves up to the fact, and again, this is what they would say is the fact of our social lives, that we are living our lives in a way that is creating suffering for those around us. And that's an element that I sadly, because I think it's a very powerful philosophical position, I don't think Schopenhauer is really developing, and I think that is one of the key things.
But to be fair to Schopenhauer, in his emphasis on the holy will, on saintliness, he does associate this a selfless generosity.
Oh, absolutely.
With communion with reality. That's what I call the maximalist element in the orientation, which veers from the minimum to the maximum. But it's clear that in Schopenhauer's view, the highest level of the hierarchy is the saint, who has this selfless action in the world, and he can have the selfless action because he has liberated himself from the will and from this posture of contentious striving in reality. And he associated that with the contemplative perspective of art, with the aesthetic attitude to the world.
Yes, I agree, and would also say, yeah, that's a very distinctive 19th century Western reading, which we should think of as such. Yes. Yes, please.
This is following up on two things that you just said.
Louder, please. We can't.
On the one hand, we cause so much suffering, like we just live, we cause so much suffering. On the other hand, committing suicide is also selfish. How do those, I'm sure those two things come together, but how do they come together in the Buddhist view? That like you're giving this opportunity to grow, and if you commit suicide, you don't grow,
Or you're not helping others. So the sacrificial act, so any act you undertake, including a horrible one like an ultimate sacrifice like that, any act you take, if you're striving from this point of view, you are striving to wake people up to the horrible suffering they are creating through their way of life. And you're trying to pinpoint actions that will help wake them up to that fact. And so you would only undertake such a horrible act as burning yourself if that act could in fact wake people up. And if it failed, then that would have been a failure as an act, a total failure as an act, because it's selfish. You're trying to withdraw, and the goal isn't to withdraw. The goal is to involve yourself to wake people up.
So the goal is to try, even if you are creating suffering, some suffering anyway, but the goal is just to keep trying.
Yeah, but Michael, this is the view you're attributing to Buddhism, right?
Yes, yes.
Because I think that in Schopenhauer,
Oh, I agree. Not sure.
we have a much, and in many manifestations of this speculative monism, the view is much more tragic. And without this emphasis on positive thinking, so to speak, to use the American vocabulary, so the world is the world, and it's terrible. It's a nightmare. And the question is, how will we awake from this nightmare? And this view is a view with tremendous potency. So this is a remarkable thing to understand about the evolution of consciousness in the West. So and now with this world revolutionary dissemination, that we have this dominant project of the ennoblement, the empowerment of ordinary humanity, the reconstruction of society. The ordinary person is discovered to have an element of the sublime, of the divine, to become more human by becoming more godlike. And there's this other view, which is saying this, we're kidding ourselves. This is not what the world is like. And and for these remarkable minds in the history of our civilization, they find this view that Schopenhauer expresses intransigently and without any kind of compromise with the positive thinking business. They find this view irresistible because it takes no hostages. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. And so you have a figure like Thomas Mann, who wrote this book, typical European bourgeois intellectual. Samuel Beckett, who would go nowhere without having the world as will and representation in his luggage. Why? Because it's as if this were the other side, with all this positive thinking, reconstruction, transformation, transcendence, and this is, as it were, the other voice. And this is a remarkable dialogue in our civilization. It's as if it were the counterpoint. So I think that in a way, although Michael has emphasized the transformative elements in Mahayana Buddhism and so forth, for us as Westerners, it is in some respects more interesting to have this radical counterpoint rather than to make it seem that we found yet another vocabulary in which to express our hopes of transformation, transcendence, lifting people up, helping people. We have plenty of that in our civilization. What we don't have is this other thing that Schopenhauer gives us. And that dialogue is something unique. It introduces a whole other element into our conversation. And it's terrifying. And the best way to deal with something terrifying like that is to face it, not to put some kind of veneer on it. And so that's my suggestion about how to approach Schopenhauer. I don't know whether that deepens our disagreement or...
It does. Not with Schopenhauer. Again, actually,
Yeah.
we agree with Schopenhauer. My disagreement was with classical Buddhism, which, no, I don't think this is a sugarcoating at all. I actually think we need to, if we're going to take these ideas seriously, allow them to challenge us.
Of course.
And reading it through a veneer
I know, but I'm
of,
disagreeing
it's about
with...
withdrawing.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing with you about how they challenge us. Because I think we have, in our civilization, 20 different ways to justify transformation, reform, compassion.
That's not what they're saying.
Well, but they are saying that. You're saying it's a different vocabulary in which to describe transformation. You could describe it as a Buddhist, you could describe it as a Marxist, as a democratic socialist. We have plenty of those. So the question is, what happens to these ideals of transformation and transcendence when we filter them through this acid liquid of almost nihilism? That's what I think is most interesting about the conversation with a philosopher like Schopenhauer. Because the question is, what will be left? What will be the residue when we have subjected these ideals to the most relentless skeptical attack? Will something be left? That is, will it dissolve everything, or will it leave a residue of greater and more reliable insight? And I think that's one of the deepest conversations in the history of philosophy, in which, as it were, we push our hopes and ideals to the limit of the abyss, and in the hope that the result will not be to destroy them completely, but to produce something greater and higher and truer. But it's a gamble. And I think that's a way to approach that.
I actually agree with that, but would simply point out again that the danger of the approach of reading each of these two traditions that we've been discussing the past 2 weeks is precisely that you risk not doing that.
You mean
In
the
other
previous
words,
ones?
Yeah, well,
the ones at the core of our
Confucianism
course.
and Buddhism.
Yeah.
That both of those risk
No,
not
no,
doing
I
that.
mean the self-invention and nonconformity one and the solidarity and
Right,
responsibility.
no, I meant the most recent two vis-a-vis the first. And so the danger is if Confucianism becomes characterized as simply largely accepting the world as it is, but slightly humanizing it, and Buddhism becomes withdrawing from the world,
never.
then there's no challenge. I mean,
No,
that,
no.
then of
Well,
course
that's
struggle
not-
with the world's
But
better.
that's never how I characterize Confucianism. I think it's just not true, Michael. I never viewed it as a conservative conception. What I said is that it's ambiguous in relation to its social template. Christianity was also, and so we try to identify its flaws, its points of contention,
Yes.
with the hope of turning it into something else.
Yes.
So it's crucial with respect to each of these traditions to try and cast light on these frailties, on these points of contention, with the practical transformative intention of turning them into something else. And I think it's crucial not to want to defend them. So I think, as I said, I think that the first project we discussed in the course, in its Nietzschean and Emersonian form, is completely unacceptable. And we shouldn't want to pretend that it's something different from what it is. We should present it in its reality, in its limitations, so that we can overcome it and transform it into something else. And we should do the same with this other tradition. I made a claim, which was surprising even to myself, about this third tradition, about this third view, which is I don't see myself how we could reconstruct it in a similar way to the way in which we proposed to reconstruct the other two projects. But maybe I'm wrong. And that would be in itself an interesting subject of discussion. How do you see that? Do you think this third position can be reconstructed?
I do. But again, it comes back to our disagreement. If it's about withdrawal, then no. I mean, that's a substantial position in certainly all traditions, most certainly including the West. I don't think it's one I would like to spend a ton of time in a philosophical reconstruction. Do I think the claim, however, that we as humans build social worlds that inherently create suffering, and our goal is to not, as in the first tradition, focus on the will as the basis of our transformation, but actually see that as precisely what is creating the problem, and then what would we do in contrast? To me, that is a huge philosophical question.
Yes,
that
but
offers a huge
if we're to
challenge.
relate, but if we're not to see this third position as simply a set of ethical practices or social practices, but as a set of practices married to a metaphysical view, the metaphysical view is a view that denies the ultimate reality of distinction and of time. And so it's not withdrawal in some literal sense. Of course, there are forms of Mahayana Buddhism that so de-emphasize the metaphysical element that it ends up as a kind of practice, a transformative practice that's metaphysically almost neutral. But the inner core of this view is a view which says the ultimate reality is unified and atemporal. And the distinction among selves is epiphenomenal. It's not for real. So there's a meaning to compassion in that metaphysical view, but it's not the literal meaning with which we're familiar, because our literal understanding of compassion is inseparable from conviction in the reality of other selves and of distinctions and of time and of transformation. So we're using the same word, but we're giving it a radically different meaning. If we say that there's no real distinction among selves, the transformations are illusory, this whole world is a hallucination, that's a different meaning. And I think we're deluding ourselves if we associate, if we give to a word like compassion or waking up or whatever, the same meaning that we would give within a view of the world in which we take time and distinction for real. It means something else, right?
Oh, that point I agree with completely. Our disagreement was on the metaphysics. So I think you're giving a very Platonic reading of the Buddhist tradition. The move in Buddhism is to say the world we perceive to be permanent is in fact one of endless
course.
flux.
But that's
and again, the nirvana is always, it's literally phrased in
Yeah.
a negative sense. Nirvana is an extinguishing of the world constructed
I
through
understand.
our will.
I understand.
And it's not a metaphysical claim, and therefore you will achieve
I know, but
Platonic forms.
I know
Yes.
part of the confusion here is you're focusing on Buddhism, and I'm trying to focus on something more general, which is the conceptual architecture of this position, as we have it more radically in the Vedanta, in the Upanishads, in Parmenides in the West, to some extent in Spinoza, and certainly in Schopenhauer. So those are the radical manifestations of this view. Buddhism, as it developed, my understanding is that it has a complicated relation to this radical form of the speculative monism. It's not a simple, unqualified version. So I think we're mixing together the discussion of what Buddhism meant historically as it evolved in this complicated relation to speculative monism with the radical speculative monist position, which I think is interesting intellectually and practically, precisely because it is so radical and intransigent. So that would suggest the utility of bifurcating the discussion into these two parts. One in which we address the position in its intransigent form, and the other in which we discuss the particulars of the evolution of Buddhism that doesn't fit into this simple conceptual vocabulary.
Well, even would strongly oppose it. I mean,
Yeah.
So it's yes. I mean, it would oppose that claim.
Yes.
Yes, it would oppose the claim that we live in a world of flux and transformation, and we're trying to achieve a contemplation of some permanence beyond us. Again, that's a standard Platonic position. The Buddhist tradition would actually oppose that. That
Yes.
would say that's part of the danger.
Yes,
Like we're positing these permanent forms
yes.
that don't exist. Yeah, they're constructs of our will.
So if you want an example in the West, in the philosophy of the West, of the uncompromising version of this speculative monism and of its ethical consequences, we have it in the philosophy of Schopenhauer.
I agree. I agree.
That's the most comprehensive statement
Yes.
of this view. And it was to that I was mainly referring, as I said, as the background, as the context of my discussion.
Other thoughts, questions? Well, should we set? Oh, please go ahead.
So I was just going to say, so this philosophy in its uncompromising form is associated with a series of psychological experiences to which we are all susceptible, among which the most obvious is the experience of depression in a generic sense. And so there's this complicated issue of what is the cognitive significance of these experiences that we all have. Are they just things that happen to us, like a sickness, or are they revelations of some truth about the world, which we try to contain? And so these metaphysical positions are readings of our experience. And so this is part of the complication of the argument that we have to have about justification and about choice. That on the one hand, it seems that we can't disregard the lessons of experience, of moral experience. So each of these views is, among other things, a promise of happiness, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It says, act as if I were true and you'll make me true. But the question is whether this self-fulfilling prophecy in practice will really be self-fulfilling. When we act on that promise, on this program, will things turn out the way that it says they'll turn out in our experience? And our experience fights back. So it doesn't happen the way it promises to happen. Something else happens. And so, and if that's the case, that in enacting one of these views, it turns out to be self-subversive in some way, then that fact is extremely pertinent to the criticism of the view and to its reinterpretation. We can't just disregard it as if it were a psychological accident. On the other hand, and this is the other side of the complication, we can't take our experiences as if they had some uncomplicated cognitive value. So we're depressed, so the world is terrible. We're euphoric, so the world is wonderful. There isn't a direct translation from the distribution of temperaments, your point about William James, and of experiences to the revelation of the truth. So here's the complication. The complication is that we can't put aside our experience. It does have cognitive value, but there's not this one-to-one relation between experience or temperament and the revelation of the truth. So this is the stuff that we have to confront, and in order to make sense of these options and to take a position with respect to them. It's very complicated. And I think it's remarkable that so late in the world history of philosophy, we have so little clarity about these things. Because this isn't the issue of choosing one position over another. It's the issue of how we understand this relation between experience and insight in the shaping of these options. And this is one of the immense values of this effort at comparative philosophy, that it forces us to engage these issues.
Yeah, I very much agree. And let me again add to the complexity. I think that's very accurate about Schopenhauer. I think Schopenhauer is working out of his depression, and it's an attempt to say, given a world of suffering that I am experiencing in my depression, what will be the response? I again would like to point out, part of the power of the classical Buddhist tradition, of course, is it's going the opposite way in terms of experience. It's not saying the Buddha himself was depressed and was suffering and therefore undertook some actions to become happy and serene, or despairing and serene in Schopenhauer's point of view. It's all about, on the contrary, he was very happy. And so the goal of the exercises is to wake us up to the fact that we are creating a world of suffering. It's not that I am personally depressed. And so,
Michael,
so I think the American version of this is
Michael,
very dangerous.
I know, but I understand your motivation, but I do disagree with you.
I know.
I do disagree with you. I do disagree with you in the account of the Buddha's experience himself. I disagree with you even on the narrow ground of the interpretation of Buddhism. It's not that the Buddha left his happy valley and then felt sad or felt compassionate for the other. That was an element of the experience. He saw a man dying. He saw a man sick.
Right.
And for him, it was a revelation of the true character of the world, of life.
That he was creating.
I know, but it's not just that he was creating. It was the revelation.
All of us, I mean.
Yes, but it was a revelation of the truth of the world. It wasn't that he...
Yes.
And that's the fundamental element.
Yes.
That the real world, the world as it really is,
That we have constructed.
is not the world that he imagined in the Happy Valley.
Oh, right, right. But the real world is the world of suffering. That's
Yes,
what
exactly.
he's seeing. He
Exactly.
created a world where he was perfectly happy, and the implication for us is we're doing the same. We think we live in a world of wonderful happiness where if we exercise our will in the world, we will be fulfilled. The argument is not that we won't, for a bit of time, be convincing ourselves we're doing so. What we're failing to realize is we are creating a world by the way we're living our lives that is inherently creating suffering. This is what the Buddha sees when he leaves that palace, and what analogically we need to see when we're doing the equivalent.
So on that interpretation, then, the redirection of action, of agency, changes the character of the world. So there's some transformation of the world. So there's
He
some
created it.
there's some transformation of the world. But before the Buddha, if the happy, because let's not have a quasi-Marxist account of this relation of the valley to what's outside.
Oh, no,
if,
it's not
if,
just
if the
sociopolitical,
palace didn't
everything.
exist, if the Buddha had never been born, if
it's
there had never been the happy, that man would still have been dying, the other one would still have been sick, they would still have been in the cries of pain. So it's not like there's this simple causal influence. He did it in the happy valley to that one outside who was, that's not the reality of the situation that the Buddha discovered. He discovered the world as it is, even if he didn't exist. And even if he hadn't had a position in the creation of that
the
circumstance.
Humans created it. No,
Yeah.
no, that is what he is seeing is the world that humans have created. No, that is the claim. It's not that the palace is the illusion and the real reality is that world out there. It's the world that he is seeing the world
It's a
that
world
humans have
in which
created.
men and women die and suffer.
Yes, because
And
the
if they
world
had
was
not
created.
acted badly and had been compassionate, they would continue to die and suffer anyway.
This world of suffering is one we have created. That is the key. Yes. It's not that he's leaving the world of illusion and seeing the world out there. He is seeing the world that we humans have created through our acts of will that we fail to realize are simply our desires playing out. That's what he sees.
Death and suffering come only from us. We did it. It wasn't